just Zach, if you get distracted by Craig's adorable picture on here with Apollo, that's understandable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I haven't taken my eyes off of it, Craig. Honestly, it's very cute.
He is the best dog on the planet, but I'm a little biased. So
yeah. I tell you, my dog is the best dog on the planet, but I just don't believe that. I love her very much, but she's not the best dog on the planet.
Oh, my wife and I were talking yesterday about how Apollo, like, other than occasionally messing in the house, which every Chihuahua will do, he doesn't do most things that dogs do. You can put your food out, he won't get in your food. He doesn't get in the trash. He doesn't. He just doesn't do those things. So
I hate you.
I know. We just got lucky. It's just pure luck.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
I can't even say my dogs are the best dogs on the planet because I'm not even convinced they're the best dogs in my house. I think Roger has me better trained. Like I'll catch it every once in a while. He'll be enticing me to do something, and I'm just like, oh no, you're literally talking to me like I'm one of the dogs. You've got me trained. I'll go sit now. Okay, thanks. Yeah, that's the way it goes. Well, hey, good morning, everybody. And let me just say, first and foremost, Happy New Year to those of you who are both joining me on this call and listening at home. Hopefully your kickoff to this new year went great. Lots of food, stuffed bellies. Maybe you had a little bit too much to drink, nursed a hangover the next day. Speaking from personal experience, of course, that's how that works. But I hope your new year is going well and continues to do so. Welcome, I should say, to the first episode of Southern Fried Geekery of 2021. And good riddance to that whole shit show that was 2020. Let's get that past us and move on with our lives. I am, as always, Caleb Alexander McKenzie.
And I'm Craig Lance.
And you may have heard a little voicey voice on the introduction that you were like, wait, that doesn't sound like Matt. And that's because it's not Matt. Our beloved Mr. Matt Trogdon is taking a little vacay this week, possibly next week. I'm not sure. I got to look at the dates, but he can't join us. So we reached out to a good friend of ours. A lot of you know him if you run in the same circles that Craig and I do, both in comics and in academia and in writing and just in general coolness, if you will. And that is Mr. Zack Kruse.
Hello. How are you?
Good, man. How's it going?
Oh, hanging in there.
Yeah.
Surviving the new year.
Working on some book stuff.
Yes, I am. I'm pausing my work on the book plates that are going out with DCBS and Challengers Comics orders. So.
Oh, nice.
Yes.
Well, that's exciting.
It is.
It's amazing how much work you've put into this stuff, but we're gonna get to that shortly, so to speak. This is episode 158 for those of you who are keeping score at home. And maybe if you are new, maybe you decided as part of your New Year's resolutions that you were going to start a podcast, start listening to a podcast this year, and you found us through the magic of the interwebs, and you're like, well, what is this thing? Who are these guys? We're a couple of folks who like to sit around on Sunday mornings. We drink our coffee like little old men at a coffee shop or a diner, and we just chit chat. We talk about the books that we've read that we either fell in love with or we found interesting or of note of some sort. We give them a little criticism, a little critique, a little tweak to see how we like them, and then we move on with our lives. We try to keep it to what we call the 50-50 rule. We're not going to drag something through the mud. We have no intention of just lambasting something for the hell of lambasting it. That's no fun. There's too much stuff out there that's good, that's positive, that you can talk about. So what's the kind of point of just wallowing in the negativity? We don't like to do that. There's other Facebook pages for that, or other, podcasts or internet shows or YouTube channels. If you just want to hear people
there's plenty of hate out there.
Yeah. We don't do that here, mainly because Craig would thump me on the ear if I did.
Whatever.
That's his dad move. Whenever I fuck up, he just reaches across and smacks me in the back of the head, and it's pretty great. But we welcome you, and if you like the show and you want more of it, you want to jump into our little communal experience, so to speak, you can do that. We have a Facebook group. It's on and popping, as the youngins like to say. It's Southern Fried Geekery. You just type that in the little search bar, and you'll find us.
I hear it slaps.
Does it slap?
Yeah, I hear that.
Is it an all-time banger?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, as the kids would say.
Yeah, boy. And then we have our Instagram and our Twitter pages. We're at SFG Podcast on both of those. Come find us. Come join in. Zach's there. He's hanging out with us on those things like a champion.
It's true.
So this week is going to be a little bit different than what our normal shows are. We because Matt's on vacation. I'm still hungover from champagne, just to be real honest. We decided that we would get together, and now that we're past our 2-week quote unquote spoiler ban, if you will, we wanted to get together with some friends, mainly Zach, and talk about a little show that came out this past 2 weeks ago. It dropped on HBO. What is that? HBO Plus, HBO Max, whatever.
HBO Max. Yeah.
That little streaming service that collects millions and billions of dollars. That that offered us a boon for free for staying in the house all year. We got Wonder Woman 84 dropped on us, and we decided we would get together and talk about it because it was very controversial, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, I don't know that it's controversial. It's just, there is a good mix of people that liked and disliked this movie.
Yeah, I feel like maybe controversial.
Polarizing. Yeah.
Polarizing.
I don't know
the word.
There is a controversial, problematic theme in the movie, but we'll get to that here in a bit.
Yeah. So before we dive into, as I like to call it, the quote unquote meat and potatoes of the book, what did you guys kind of think of it? Just the 30,000 foot view.
Zach, you're the guest. Why don't you go first?
Sure, man. I appreciated it for what it tried to do. I think it did, in spite of a lot of things. I think it did try to be different from the other DC movies. So I think that in and of itself is worth commending. And I thought that several of the individual performances were really good too. So there were things to like about it. There were things to appreciate, and also, Caleb, you were saying that it's a polarizing movie, which is true. But it's also one of those things where even though it wasn't the movie for me, I have a hard time getting really riled up and angry at a movie,
Right.
Especially something that comes from the sort of tapestry of comic book films that we have now. I mean, if you don't like it, that's okay, but I mean, this it wasn't the greatest thing, but there were nuggets in there to sort of extract and sort of appreciate and enjoy. So
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that pretty well sums it up. I thought that Gal Gadot is amazing as Wonder Woman. She's been perfectly cast in that role, and I would watch 2-hour Wonder Woman movies all the time with her in them. There are some problems with the plot is a little bit of a mess in this, but I overall, I thought it was okay. It's fun at times, and at other times you're just like, okay, that was, could have been cut out. But overall, I would say it's an okay movie. I wouldn't say it was great or horrible.
Yeah, so I think we're all kind of centered in the same spot. Personally, and this is my feelings on the film, and you'll kind of get this as the movie goes on. As a whole, as an entire package, as the way it was presented to us, I think it's arguably a bad film, which is fine, right? Like, we watch lots of bad films. I've nobody's batting even 500 when it comes to filmmaking. And in the DC universe, they seem to have some issues putting together a coherent, cohesive package when it comes to any of their films. So I think overall, yeah, I mean, there is valid criticism to be said about the quality of the film, and that's fine. But there were enough little nuggets in here of it was a bad film that contained some really smart attempts at commentary and criticism, which I tend to nerd out on when I see those things, right? Those are I like Zach said, they tried to do something else in here, and they tried to inject some really highbrow, really quality social criticism of the last 40 years into what I call a popcorn movie, a tentpole film. And they tried to, in doing so, what they were trying to do is kind of deliver this little bit of an art film quality, something that you wouldn't normally get a whole lot of butts and seats for, into a genre film. And I appreciate that anytime I see it. And in doing so, that elevates my appreciation of the movie, so I can watch a quote unquote bad film and still leave feeling, like I didn't waste my money. Like I felt like in this case, my money was already spent because it's a streaming service, but I still felt like I didn't waste my time. Right. And so that's honor. Like there's something in that I appreciated, and it let me nerd out for a little bit, and it made me think, which I've said before on the show about comics, about books, about anything. I can read something that I think is generally, again, quote unquote bad. If it makes me think about things beyond what it was on the face value, then that's time well spent, right? Like that, like art should make you think beyond itself. It should entice you to look at broader pictures and broader themes about things. And this did that, even with some bad CGI. So that's where I'm at with it. And it sounds like that's where a lot of, not only us, but a lot of folks were at with it. I mean, some people were just readily, I think a lot of folks wanted to dismiss it just because, oh, okay, this is a popcorn film and it had those problems, therefore it's just meh. But I really think that those elements that we all dug into were at least there, if not on the surface, just slightly below. And you gotta look at them if you're going to understand the film, or just why watch anything. Of course, that's also the English major inside my brain.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is, the other thing about this too, and I hope this doesn't sound some kind of way, but I mean, with very rare exceptions, if you're coming to a movie like this and you expect it to be Godard or something like that, then I don't know what to tell you.
Right.
Like, it's not. I mean, there are a lot of like bad movie making choices that happen in this movie. A lot of really bad movie making choices, but I don't know. Like you said, I don't know what someone would be expecting coming into this. Like, were they expecting? It doesn't even have to be like highbrow. Like, like this is not a Spielberg movie. It's not going to have like those really wonderful crane shots that swoop in and around. I mean, it's not going to have, it's not, it's not, like I said, it's not a Godard movie. It's not any of those things. It's a movie that exists in this very particular context where these things are fed to us on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you're just not, if you're expecting something like really like, I don't know, like energizing and innovative, I think you might have chosen the wrong genre of film to be watching, right? Like, I don't think you're going to get innovation out of a comic book movie. I think you're going to get a comic book movie, something that's supposed to entertain you and make you forget about things for a couple hours.
See, and I use that same point when it comes to Star Wars movies, when people will start bitching about this or that or whatever. And I'm like, just because I love it doesn't mean I think that it's, Citizen Kane or Godfather. Those are a different style of movie and are graded different.
Mm-hmm.
And so I 100% agree with what Zach's saying there, that, with you have to look at these movies within the genres that they're intended to be enjoyed as.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in doing so, like I said, and it may be the situation that when you go in with low or no expectations, you're more likely to be surprised, right? So and maybe that's where I'm at with it, with superhero movies in general, but specifically with these Warner Brother films is I don't necessarily have high expectations. The bar's not very high, so they can clear it fairly easily. And even this one, I think, even though they kind of landed smack in the middle of the bar, with arms and legs stretched out in the middle of it like a cartoon, there was enough in there that like yeah, it's not Godard. This is not quote unquote art film, but there were enough of those elements I was able to pull from it that made me happy, just because, like I said, I got to get online and nerd out and talk to some friends about it. So, but let's actually talk about like you said, there were some issues with the plot. I think I'm not going to spend a long time recapping a 2.5 hour long movie, especially when folks at home can just log on and go see it, or
Thank God.
yeah, they've probably already seen it. So just the short and brief of it. The film takes place in the 80s. There are lots of visual cues for that. Very mall scene-ish. It's meant to look and read like an action hero film from the 80s. Wonder Woman is doing her thing. She is working at the Smithsonian. Arguably has a successful career, is staying kind of in the shadows. Goes to work one day and there is a new figure coming into the office who's just been hired. Kristen Wiig's character, Barbara. She is a number of things, but mostly, she's an anthropologist and a gemologist, which plays into the larger role of the film. Meanwhile, while they're settling in and finding her place, and of course, Barbara is this type of person who is overlooked by everyone. She's the quintessential under the radar, quote unquote, nerd that no one pays attention to. And she's like, the people who hired her don't even remember her name. So they settle in, they kind of start this sisterhood, arguably some romantic themes in there. But they're doing their thing. Meanwhile, when all of this is going on in the broader scope of the world, there is this man. His name is Max Lord, and of those of you who have read a comic book once or twice in your life, that should pique your interest. He is kind of this up and coming public figure, so to speak. He has tried to entice people to buy in to this oil company, Black Gold. Essentially, he's a grifter. There was never any chance of this company making money. He bought a bunch of wells that were dry and is trying to just worm his way and part fools from their money. And of course, as he does this, he's running out of options because the grift is starting to, people are catching on. Like there's no returns. His investors are barking at him. They want to know where their money is. And there's not a lot of room left without some type of, call it divine intervention, plot armor, what have you. Which of course, because it's a movie and these things are written the way they are, tends to fall into his lap. There is a company that is selling, they have a little black market operation. They are selling all kinds of antiquities, gems, what have you. All these things that, Diana and Barbara would need to study out of like the back of a mall store, which gets robbed, of course. And so what falls into their hands? But this stone, this gem, which is seemingly not even that rare. It's a gem that's kind of used in a lot of fakes. It's, it's pretty, it's got some inscription on it. But what they come to find out throughout the film is that this gem grants wishes. It grants each person who holds it one wish, and not realizing what she's doing, Diana, of course, wishes for her one true love to come back, Steve. And magically he does. He shows up in the body of some unsuspecting and really without note man who he just kind of takes over his life and body, and lots of consent issues that did get noted on the internet quite a bit. Of course, Barbara turns around and she wishes to have all the powers of, at least the prowess of Diana, who she sees as this statuesque person that everybody likes. She's smart, she's strong, she's powerful. She doesn't realize she's Wonder Woman, but she ends up getting those powers. Long story short, the rock falls into Max Lord's hands, who seems to know about it somehow. He knows about the magic qualities, the otherworldly properties of this gem. And his wish is that he becomes the gem. So it kind of absorbs him into himself. So now Max Lord has the power to grant people wishes, to go around one by one. And in doing so, in granting these wishes, he takes something in return. They're conditional, right? Almost the ultimate grifting power. So he goes about his business of going through just individual folks, kind of working his way up the social ladder. He goes to people who are oil barons and oil sultans, and people who wish for wealth and prosperity, and wish wealth and prosperity on him. All the while in doing this, he's struggling to be a single father, of course, and he is neglecting his duties as a dad. You get to see his kid every once in a while pop in and just want to do kid things, want to be noticed by his dad, and kind of get sloughed off, right? Like it's kind of sad. So as these things come to a head, Diana realizes what's happening. She's got to stop Maxwell Lord. Lots of cool fight scenes, traversing the world. There's an invisible jet that somehow makes its way into the show. There's lassoing of lightning bolts, yada, yada, yada. You can go watch the movie. It's fun. I'm not going to recap all the action scenes. Inevitably, what happens is Max Lord tries to use and this time, the new and burgeoning technology of satellites and cable television, which permeate Western culture, to encapsulate people, to use that so everyone can be granted a wish at the same time, levying him almost godlike power over man and government and the world and everything else. And Diana has to find a way to defeat him. And she, like a good Wonder Woman story is wont to do, she punches her way all the way up to the top just to realize that for Diana, for Wonder Woman, that punching and violence isn't going to save the day. The power of love, the power of actualization, and a little bit of bondage saves the day. Lots of changes happen. So I feel like that's a good recap of the story, right? Did I miss anything major?
No, I think that about handles it.
Oh, I mean, Barbara becomes a cat, right? Like, she adopted like the Broadway show, and looks like a bad CGI version of that. Not necessarily bad. That was one of actually her look was one of the better CGI things about the film. So no, I think that's great. So why don't we talk about some of the details and stuff? We'll kind of go around that we all enjoyed. Like I like starting off on a good foot, right? There's lots of things that were problematic, but Zach, why don't you tell us a few things about the film that you actually liked, that made you happy?
Well, like I said, there's several of the individual performances I thought were pretty good. One thing I did like, or that I did appreciate about it, even though I wasn't crazy about the ending, I think the ending is problematic. I mean, we can talk about that later. I did really appreciate that it tried to end a superhero movie in some way other than violence, and that it tried to, I wouldn't argue successfully, but that it attempted to close out a film that ended with, healing and resilience and all of those things, as opposed to, more destruction or punching someone, into the sun or something like that. I thought was really commendable and an interesting sort of, move, especially for, coming out of like the Snyderverse of DC films, right? So I thought that was the one thing that, even though I didn't care for its politics, I really appreciated about it. The other thing that I thought was pretty good was I thought that, for as much as I gotta be honest, I just hate 80s nostalgia now. Like I just hate it. It just makes me cringe for a variety of reasons. And I don't think that this movie always got it right, but there were moments where, like, even as it was sort of cascading through like the shopping mall, sort of terrain that is part of like the imaginary 1980s, I thought that it captured that feeling really well. And without overdoing it in a certain way. There were scenes in that mall that I was like, oh, I've been to this mall, even though I haven't been to that mall, but because it's not a real mall, but it's it felt genuine in that way. So I really like the way that it captured sort of the moment, or tried to capture the moment.
Yeah, I just co-signing on that with the way that they ended, and that's the way for me, look, Wonder Woman is and to be fair, this probably reflected a lot of the way I saw the film. Wonder Woman's my favorite DC character, and partially because George Perez is my favorite one, and one of my top 5 artists of all time. That's what brought me to the book. But her stories shouldn't end in violence, right? Like, so they, like, whoever, and this movie was made by committee, but at least somebody in that committee understands the makeup of that character. And so the fact that they went out of their way to try to end it in a way that wasn't just, again, hyper violence, or missing the mark of what the genetics of that character is. That just made me incredibly happy, because that's the way it should be. She is a character who is all about love, or who is all about truth. And the truth is that violence begets more violence. And I think she realizes that, and she tries to help people uncover those things, like get to the deeper meaning behind it. And sometimes, like in the last movie, you can't do that. You got to punch war in the face. But in this one, I think she found a way to really tap into the emotive side of humanity, the empathetic side, or at least she tried to. Again, I don't know how successful they were in that, other than making it a shoehorn moment. But it was a valid attempt. It was commendable.
That they did it at all, right? Means something. So.
Yeah, you see very few superhero movies that don't rely on violence anymore. And sometimes when they do, you kind of get the complaint, Superman Returns, there was not, any punches thrown in the entire movie, and people complained about that. So, it's all in how it's executed, right?
Yeah, or even when you do, with just thinking of like quote unquote superheroes under a big umbrella, when you do get like a non-violent solution, it's in, quote, things are infantilized, like they're considered childish, like Tiny Titans or superhero girls from DC, because they're like, okay, well, violence is an adult theme, and we can only put non-violent resolutions in kids' books. And I think that's, number one, an abhorrent way to look at the world. It's not juvenile to think of non-violence as a solution to the situation that these characters put themselves in, or are put in. And so I don't know, like, it was good to see them try to do that. It kind of depresses me, because that was one of the complaints I saw on the film, was that, kind of everywhere, was that, it felt like I was watching a kid's movie by the end of it. And on one hand, I want to be like, you're watching a superhero film, right? Like, what, did you need me to connect those dots for you? But on the other hand, non-violent resolution shouldn't seem childish. Like, I hate that we live in a world that thinks of, at least in our pop culture, that thinks of non-violent resolutions as infantile. Like, that's not okay. Like, that made me, the reaction to that made me sad. But yeah, no. Well, what are some of the other parts that you really dug? Or I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut somebody off there.
Oh, I was going to say, I mean, that in some ways that kind of makes it an anti-80s movie, though, right?
Right.
So,
yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
We needed Danny Glover snorting cocaine and smoking a cigar with a machine gun.
Yeah.
Well, what are some other moments that you really dug, Craig?
Again, I thought Gal Gadot's performance was, she's been my favorite part of the DC universe movies, whatever they're calling it.
Mm-hmm.
All along, she's been my favorite part, and she continues to be. I really, even though this scene could have been left on the cutting room floor and it would have made no difference to the movie, the opening sequence with young Diana trying to win the competition on Themyscira, I thought was a very well done scene that I enjoyed quite a bit. There's moments throughout the film that I enjoyed. A lot of them, the scene in the Middle East, kind of the convoy scene, was okay. It wasn't great, but I did enjoy it from an action sequence.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
As far as the action scenes go, the convoy scene was one of my favorites.
Again, unneeded, but it was a good action scene.
I don't know that I don't know that I would say it was unneeded. I think it did a really good job of showing how her waning powers, she could move past them, like she could still build on them, and she was still making the sacrifice. I think that was a good. I don't know. Like, I know exactly what you mean when you say it was unneeded. And a lot of people think the Middle Eastern scenes in general were unneeded and unnecessary. I think that they had to be in there to tap into the broader story that they were telling, or at least the the larger conceptual story that's a part of it, as far as and we'll talk about that in a little bit. I'm gonna kind of bury the lead there, but just the Americans will inject themselves into foreign politics for oil, kind of theme of it. So I think they had to go there. But yeah, that was one of my the more quote unquote fun sequences of the film. I enjoyed that quite a bit.
Yeah, there were some good shots in there. In a movie with some problematic shots, to me, there was some good shots in that action sequence. So.
Yeah,
but probably my favorite again was the opening sequence, that the pre-credit scene.
So I got to say, shout out to our buddy Arnie, because he made the connection and made an amazing joke. The whole point of that scene was to show that you can't take shortcuts, or you're going to be a ... cheetah.
Oh,
see, dad jokes.
Dear.
Yep. See how that worked out.
Yeah.
Dear. When you put it that way, that makes sense. But
it does add a level to that sequence that I didn't connect.
Though, the other thing that I thought about that sequence, even while watching it, is I don't think I was as big a fan of it as you were, Craig. But the thing that I did like about that is that when she cheats, like, they don't let her win. And again, like the nonviolent ending, that's also like super, like, runs in a very opposite direction of most 80s movies that we grew up watching, right? Like, where the hero cheats. Karate Kid, Danny cheats. Then in the movie Rad, Crew Jones cheats. I mean, everybody sort of cheats, or they use like their cunning or guile to find some sort of secret like way around the rules, right. In order to win. And that they didn't let her do that sort of runs in a very different direction than the era, right, that they're trying to present us with. So.
Well, and not only that, just the line in there that there's no shame in not being in first place. There's no shame in not succeeding at something that you weren't necessarily ready to succeed at.
Right.
Which I think is an important lesson, not only for kids, but for everyone. Yeah. Right. Like, especially in our world where we, if you're not first, you're last, to quote a terrible movie. And it was cool to see that. Also, I like the way that scene really did remind us of where she came from, and whether or not it actually was successful in playing in at the overall story. It really did remind folks, the small segment of folks out there who might not have seen the first movie, who might not be familiar with it. It gave them an inkling of where she came from, who she was, the fact that she is this hyper powered individual with connections to Greek mythology, and it really set up a foundation for who she was. That went on to play a larger role in what the story was trying to do. Again, the success of that being in question, but I think there was a reason that they were there, and plus it's pretty, right? Like, it's cool to see Themyscira.
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of a, since this is a movie that is intended to take place in the 80s, it is kind of a throwback to a lot of those action films where you have an opening sequence. Specifically, you brought up Danny Glover earlier. You can look at the Lethal Weapon movies. There's always like this action sequence in these buddy cop movies that don't mean anything to the overall plot of the story.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of the thing there, is that, hey, here's a good action sequence to get you involved, but it doesn't mean anything.
I mean, Predator 2 is a good example of that, where they give you the whole like cocaine gunfight. They didn't need that. Like, that was just an excuse to get people snorting cocaine and shooting machine guns, but it was still fun. Which actually, that leads into one of my favorite parts of the film. Something I think they did well was they modeled it off of an 80s action movie, and not only in the format and in like the construction of it, and the way that the film was shot. There were some things that people were, I think, had problems with that I didn't, which was the quote unquote cheesiness of certain scenes of it, like the mall scene, because we don't do that anymore. Like, the quote unquote mall is all but dead in the United States now, right? Like, people don't, with the advent of Amazon and stuff, people don't have that same kind of shared communal experience. But to see those done in a way that really did invoke the feeling of the 80s movie scenes, of, you know, the Babysitter's Club, things like that, where they go into these public places, and you see the cheesy robbery happen. You know, I think that they were really trying to invoke maybe nostalgia, but I think maybe they were just using it as a blueprint. They wanted it to look and feel like an 80s movie. And I think some of that might have played into some of the CGI choices that were made. You know, there's one CGI scene where Diana's flying, and it's bad CGI, right? Like it's not good. It's not what we would consider to be a successful CGI scene up to today's standards, especially not with what you see Marvel and things doing. But it looks a lot like what they used to do in the television show. And I think that was a choice. It might not have been a good choice, but it's one that personally I'm glad they made, because I can look past it if that's the reason it was done. And I don't know for a fact that it was, but it really did. It made me think of those old movies. It made me think about Superman done in the 80s. It made me think about the Wonder Woman television show and the way that they would show people flying, because it invoked that, for better or worse. And I thought that was cool, but that could just be me. The flip side of that, something that I thought the film did well, is it didn't. The nostalgia of the movie was an aspect of the setting and not the plot, in my opinion. Any nostalgia that, especially in the movies that is so ramped up on the 80s, and in the current world we live in, where people want like shows like Cobra Kai, shows like, which is just nostalgia distilled down and slammed into your veins, shows like Stranger Things, which is all about that era, and uses music and uses quirks and things of that era, just again purely for that aspect, for nostalgia's sake. I don't think this movie tried to necessarily. I don't think it wanted to do that per se. I think a little bit of it did, but I think the nostalgia was an aspect of the setting and not the plot. And I appreciated that, because kind of in what Zach was saying, I'm not a fan of nostalgia for the sake of nostalgia. When we get comics, and we get them all the time, and I talk about it on this show, and it's just purely like nostalgia of the character, told for no other reason than just to remind middle-aged white dudes like myself why we fell in love with the character when we were kids. But it doesn't entice new readers, and it doesn't do anything to grab people in a modern, like in real time. I don't like that. Like you can tie in nostalgia as an aspect of it to, you know, as a wink and a nod to people who are grown enough to realize it. But I think you're losing a younger audience, at least in comics, when you do that. And I appreciated the fact that they didn't seem to, in my opinion, do that with this movie.
Well, I mean, if you're specifically talking about the nostalgia aspect, I'll give you that. But if you're talking about the fact that it takes place in the 80s, the very specific plot point of the excess of the 80s is kind of the point.
Oh yeah. No, I agree.
Okay.
With that. But
okay.
Again, that's the 80s. Like,
right.
That went into the fashion and the attitudes and the art of the time. Like that just exuded. So you can't have it set in the 80s and really not have it have that without anything that identifies it as being in the 80s. I mean, there's some parts of the 80s that are kind of universal, you know, the Midwestern experience of everything that doesn't seem to change, but they really dialed into it.
Two polos on with the collars up.
Oh God! Dude, that's not even necessarily an 80s thing. Like, I dated a dude in my early 20s who used to do that shit, which should have been my first sign that wasn't going well. And it didn't. It was bad. So, but the other, I thought Kristen Wiig did an amazing job in this film. And she was one of the casting choices that I questioned, because especially when they announced that she was going to be Barbara. I know Kristen Wiig from her comedy roles. I think Bridesmaid is hilarious. Bridesmaid is one of the few comedies that I'll watch multiple times, or that I have watched multiple times and will continue to watch. And it's not necessarily within my wheelhouse, but I think that movie's hilarious. But I was wondering how they were going to do Kristen Wiig as Cheetah, because I'm not familiar with her being in relatively serious roles. And I thought she did a really good job. She kind of played the straight man in moments. There were moments that were funny, that were just kind of funny because of the awkwardness of it all, which I think is that's one of the things that makes Kristen Wiig's comedy work. But no, I thought she was great as Barbara. I think the way that she approached the character really worked. I think as far as just the aesthetics of it, she has a great look. She has a feline look in general. She's very Celine when she wants to be. And to see her take on a little bit of a glamorous attitude was a little bit different from what I'm used to seeing her, when she actually, like, when she took on some of the aspects of Diana and brought the fashion and the attitude and the "I'm woman, hear me roar," or at least get the fuck out of my way aspect of it. I was impressed. Like, I thought she came off really strong. I thought Gal Gadot looked more comfortable in front of the camera than I've seen her before. She's not necessarily somebody that I would call a quote unquote thespian. I think she makes a great action hero star. She's arguably one of the most gorgeous creatures on this earth. And I say that as somebody who is quote unquote strictly dickly, but I think she's just statuesque and fabulous. And I hear rumors that straight guys tend to think she's attractive. I don't know. I'll have to confer with you guys on that, but she's gorgeous.
Can confirm.
Yeah. But she really did. She looked more comfortable in her acting roles. Not great. Like, she had moments where I'm like, okay, the director was doing his best. So, but she leaned into it. I wasn't crazy about shit. I don't have IMDb in front of me. IMDb. Max Lord, The Mandalorian. Help me out.
Pedro Pascal.
Yeah, Pedro Pascal. I wasn't crazy about his performance, and I don't know why.
I think it was direction and script more than his performance.
Might have been. I think he was really trying to channel this charismatic, over-the-top, cheesy, I don't even know if you can call it 80s, because we see it today, television figure who's supposed to make people latch on to him for his charisma. I don't know that it worked. I think he tried really hard. I just don't know that it worked. He to me was one of the weaker links of the film.
It's really weird because we kind of see the two female roles opposite.
Oh, do we? Okay.
Who performed better? I thought that Kristen Wiig played Kristen Wiig as I've seen her in every other movie she plays.
Okay.
But that's if that's what they were going for, they certainly succeeded in it. And Gal Gadot, I think, did a fantastic job, but I've said that a couple of times now, so I'll let that sit. But and again, it may be the person as much as the actress. I don't know.
Yeah.
And that's not being critical of your choices of what you liked or whatever.
Oh no,
I hope you don't see it that way. I felt. Have you seen the new Ghostbusters with the female-led Ghostbusters?
I've not. No.
Okay.
Although I do like Leslie Jones.
Yeah, Kristen Wiig pretty much plays the same character in that role.
Okay.
It's kind of and maybe it's because I've just seen that movie recently that it stuck out so much for me. But now I will give her credit for the rolling into playing a Diana-like character as she became more of, Cheetah. I'll give her credit for that because she did adapt and do that very, very well, though.
Yeah, that the 180 in her, her body language, I think, is more so what it was.
And I don't remember. It's been so long since I've read a Barbara origin story. I don't remember her being that awkward.
I think that
could be a choice strictly for the movies, and that's neither here nor there. I'm fine with them making those sorts of changes.
Yeah. So Zach, as far as characters go, I know you said that you really enjoyed some of the performances. And we've mentioned several, but you want to tell us which ones that really jumped out to you?
Yeah, I was just kind of writing it out there for a little bit, but I thought Kristen Wiig was pretty good. I'm on the pro Kristen Wiig camp in this one.
Yeah.
And I thought Gal Gadot was okay. In terms of her appeal, right? Like that's undeniable as far as I'm concerned. But I, as a performer, I thought this was better than the last couple of times. I think that she did look more comfortable. I thought that it was a little more fluid, but I just not sure that she's a great actress. But I thought Kristen Wiig was really good, and I thought Pedro Pascal was okay. It wasn't quite how I imagine Maxwell Lord, which is neither good, bad, or indifferent. That's just not like my head canon of how Maxwell Lord sort of behaves, right? I always imagine him to be much more smarmy and not so I just imagine him being much smoother, right? Like I don't imagine him being the bumbler or the bumbling sort of grifter that he is in the opening sequences. Like I imagine him being much smoother and like much more compelling, like when his nose bleeds, like when he's pushing someone to do something, like there's some sort of heft to that. And I just didn't see that with this version of the character, but that's also because it's a totally different version of the character that has nothing to do with my headcanon from the comics. So
right.
So there's that. But I thought Kristen Wiig was really good, and even though I didn't care for this version of Max Lord so much, I thought Pedro Pascal was pretty good as he could have been with given the material. So
I mean, we saw his face less than we did in the last episode of The Mandalorian. So
it's true.
Like, where's this man? Get this man a helmet right now. Max Lord is not my favorite Wonder Woman character anyway. And so I'm kind of, when it comes to that, I'm kind of like, okay, just give me what you want to give me. It was all right. It felt clunky. I think you hit the nail on the head, and I didn't realize it before this moment. But I think it felt clunky. His performance did.
Yeah.
He just kind of bumbled. He was a bumbling person, and there's only room enough for one bumbling person on this podcast, and that's me. So I can't be on it.
Oh.
So all right, we've spoken about the good. Let's rip the Band-Aid off and talk about some of the bad. And we'll just keep going like we're going. And Zach, lean into it.
Okay, so I don't think that this movie had any idea what it was trying to say.
Yeah,
I think that there are moments where it was really clear, and what it was trying to get across as it relates to the ending. I don't think it was successful in that, but I understood what it was trying to say, and I thought that was clear. I think that the nostalgia stuff is the right choice. So like we already talked about, even though of my aversion, but politically, like the political statements that this movie seems to be trying to make are just garbled. They're just really garbled. I think that it's aware of sort of the peculiarities and like the peculiar connections between sort of wish thinking, right, and mind power, and the power of positive thinking, which Max Lord more or less explicitly cites.
Oh, he does 100%.
Right. I mean, he just says the power of positive thinking, but he doesn't quote. I don't think he quotes Peele. That's what I mean. But other than like being aware of those things, I don't think it actually knows what to do with them. And it may be that Jeff Johns and Patty Jenkins do know what to do with them and do understand them. But once committee involvement starts to happen, in a production like this, which I don't know anything about, that could have garbled it. But it seems really confused. And I think part of the thing that makes it seem so confused to me is that it doesn't seem to understand that the problem with the power of positive thinking, right? The problem with Norman Vincent Peale, the problem with Dale Carnegie, the problem with Pat Robertson or Billy Graham or take your pick, anyone that's sort of in that milieu, right? Like, is that the problem isn't wishes coming true. The problem is the grift that wishes can come true, right? It's that's what's being sold to people, is the idea that something is possible that is actively not possible. That's the problem. And as I read and watch the movie, it seems to me that the movie seems to think that it's wishes coming true that create these problems, right? So like every bad thing that happens to a person in this movie is because their wish comes true, not because Max Lord sold them a wish, but because they got what they wanted. And I get sort of the monkey's paw angle of that, like that, of course. I mean, every sort of monkey paw type story has that angle, but that angle is not the same as the angle that is sold, right? That is pitched, that is hyped by sort of New Thought and the power of positive thinking and the prosperity gospel and all that kind of stuff. Like that's a different thing. So when they mix those two things together, I just don't think that those ingredients taste good, right? Like they don't work together because they're trying to say two very different things that aren't really, to my mind, are not really reflective of the real sort of problems. So when we were talking about this on Facebook, like one of the, and I think that your read on this is different than mine, Caleb, but like towards the end of the movie, when there's that couple, they're like, they must be in Scotland or they're somewhere in the UK, right? And they're arguing and she's getting mad at him because he's Irish and he says that he wishes she was dead. And then his wish comes true and then she collapses and apparently nearly dies, right? And the only way that is corrected is by him wishing again, right? That like he wishes that he hadn't made his wish. I mean, that's the literal action. So it seems that like the movie seems to think that these wishes can come true. They do come true. And that it's not the problem of wish thinking, it's the problem of making sure that you have the right wish. And, you know, I think if you approach it from that angle, then that sort of reinscribes the same problem over and over again, that the grifters that sell the power of positive thinking, that sell the prosperity gospel, it's not the grifter that's wrong. It's you, the individual, that makes a mistake. And that's a very sort of neoliberal capitalist approach and worldview that says that the system isn't broken. You, the individual person, are broken. So if you want good things to happen, then you better behave yourself. And if bad things happen, it's your fault. That's a really troubling worldview. And I think undermines a lot of what undermines some of the positivity that the movie, I think, is aspiring towards. Because even if we assume that the movie is trying to sort of rebuke some of these, you know, more difficult and troubling sort of 80s film tropes, like an obsession with winning and an obsession with, you know, cheating to win, or an obsession with, you know, masculine violence, and that you can punch your problems away. Even though it's trying to sort of undo those narratives, which is really commendable, it's still sort of reinscribing some of the same sort of problems that make those narratives really palatable and make them really useful, right? So, and I think that without making too many assumptions, right? Because I do want to be generous towards the filmmakers, but when you have that kind of narrative built in, that it is the individual's fault, right? That it is your fault because you made a bad wish or you made a bad deal. Then that really makes it easy to sort of latch onto some racist and sexist and homophobic, you know, really ugly, bigoted ideologies, right? So it's not the system's fault that we have people trapped in cycles of poverty, right? It's that individual's fault because they didn't work hard enough in that moment, or they didn't, or in the context of the movie, they didn't wish for the right thing. That's still the secret, right? That's still Rhonda Byrne. That's still a problem. So I think in that way, the movie is just, it doesn't, I think the most generous thing I can say about it is that it just doesn't understand what it's trying to say. It's incoherent in the way it's trying to grapple with this problem. And that might not be a problem, a writerly problem. That might be, you know, a production problem.
Cultural problem.
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, broadly, it's a cultural problem, right? But I guess what I'm suggesting is that, like, I'm not ready to just lay all of that at the feet of Patty Jenkins and Jeff Johns, right? I'm more than happy to to entertain the thought that someone from AT&T came down and said, wait a minute. We have a perspective here. That's entirely possible. But so that's the thing that I think just drives me that drove me bananas about this movie. That was the worst part to me, because it does this thing that neoliberal capitalism always does. It distracts you, and I mean, it is, and in certain ways, I mean, this is the grift too. It distracts you from the real problem by sort of reinscribing its own and perpetuating itself over and over again, while sort of distracting you with these other things, and making you forget that sort of like where the real problems lie. And the real problems lie with white supremacy. The real problems lie with capitalism. The real problems lie with corporate culture, right? But if we just get you to think these warm and fuzzy thoughts about, hey, they didn't punch anybody at the end of this, so, you know, that feels good. Meanwhile, they're sort of still, you know, putting little bits of bleach into your drink, you know, just very slowly poisoning you. So that really sort of really chafed at me throughout all of this. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to go too much on a rant about it, but I mean, I thought that was the biggest problem with the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's a hell of a point. I'll let Caleb follow that point up.
Well, first of all, you feel free to go on as big of a rant as you want to, because I like it. Number one.
Yeah.
So I agree. And this is just from my perspective, and I will 1000% concede that Dr. Kruse over here is the expert on the material. And in that, I love the way he interpreted it, but he's correct in the fact that we read it differently towards the end. And we kind of, again, we've had this conversation a little bit. I agree with everything that you just said up until the exact moment. And not necessarily that I disagree with it. Because I think it does put the onus, it does put, I don't know if blame's the right word for the way I take it, but it puts the onus on the wisher. I read it a little bit of a different way. I don't see it as a complete ignoring of where the blame goes. I see it as this, they're not necessarily looking at the cause as much of a way to repudiate the effect. And how to do it. So, and in kind of reading it into what the way I view our current culture, there's this kind of purveyance of I read an article the other day, and they coined a phrase, or at least it was kind of the first time I'd seen it coined, of toxic individualism as this kind of emergence of, you know, neo-libertarianism or neo-capitalism, that I think is absolutely where we're at right now. And the only, as a culture, I mean, not even just in the 80s, we're talking about in the year of our Lord 2020. I think that's exactly where we are. We're in this era of incredibly toxic individualism, where, you know, one of our major parties has turned into the cult of "fuck you, I've got mine." That we have to get past. And I think the only way that we get past that is at the very basics of our culture, of the individual, where this idea of toxic individual is enticing, is kind of taking people over, is this kind of grassroots mass repudiation of toxic individualism, where people give up, like they renounce, you know, if what we're talking about is the effect of what I consider to be the greatest grift of the 21st and 20th centuries, renouncing that toxic individualism, renouncing the elimination and the almost erasure of the idea of communal aspects of society by blaming, in our case, in the real world, we call it socialism. And we look at the bad aspects of the propaganda that came out of the Cold War, and we say all these things are terrible. We have to get rid of it. You're what matters, as long as you're going to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. The only way we get past that as a culture is kind of this mass, like I said, repudiation of that, where the group, even the people who bought into it, right? Even the people who did succumb to the grift, they have to say, okay, and they do have to take some of the blame on themselves, because I think part of that is, especially if we want to talk about Trumpism in today's world, there are people who did buy into the white supremacy, who are actively buying into the bootstraps idea of of capitalism that doesn't work, this trickle down economics effect that we have seen just fail for decades. I think the people do at the localized level, they have to accept, okay, yes, I bought into this, and yes, it is on me. The onus is on me to repudiate this, to push it out, to just deny its effect any longer, and do what I have to do as an individual that might not necessarily provide me a mental pathway to success or to prominence or to wealth, but it's for the good of the whole. And I realize that's incredibly, like I said, keyword is socialistic thinking there, but it's on the individual to make sure that they work together for the good of culture, for the good of society as a whole. And I think, and again, I don't know that they were successful in doing that, but at least that's the way I read the end of the film. Was this very, it is on everyone who made the wish, and yes, some of the onus, some of the fault is on them, but it's on everyone who kind of fell into this post 80s, post Cold War neo. I don't like, neoliberal is the correct phrase, but I think it even goes beyond that. It's the building blocks of authoritarianism at the end of the day, but it's on us to push back against that. And of course, I think that whole message is coupled in the middle of the fact that this movie was made by a giant cog of the capitalist machine, right? Like it is made by Warner Brothers, who is owned by AT&T, who has a vested interest in seeing capitalism continue to give them incredibly insane bonuses. And they wanted this to, they showed it for free for what? They're showing it for 30 days and they're going to make people buy it. So they're wanting people to buy into it, to the streaming service, to everything else. But also, I think that, and this may have, again, you can't completely say, I'm giving my opinion, and a little bit I'm just kind of saying what might have been. So you can't take this at anything but the fact that this is Caleb's brain at work. But the movie was produced by the Snyders. It is part of the quote unquote Snyderverse of films. They can't that at the end of this movie, they can't create an ending that does wipe away with capitalism, that does wipe away with the great grift, that that will not set the platform for millionaires and billionaires. Because if you do that, then you don't get Bruce Wayne 20 years later. And you don't get everything that the kind of post-world, the world post this movie is based on. If they're including this in the canonization of, Batman v Superman and the Justice League and all of those things that seemingly happens decades later after this film, they can't erase the platform that this is built on. So those things, like the idea of the good side of capitalism for this film, kind of has to be, they have to return to the status quo. I say have to, they don't have to do anything. They can do what they want. But I think maybe in their minds, they made it work. And again, that could just be me wanting to find a way to forgive some things that I don't necessarily want to forgive, or it, I try to think about these things as far as the logistics of the film by committee goes. And so, yeah, maybe that's where I'm at.
I think you're pulling a little bit hard on it, because there are movies made all the time by big capitalistic companies that, I mean, I can think Elysium, for one, is a well done science fiction movie that pretty much spits all over capitalism without having to be, I mean, and it's in your face, but it's just part of the plot.
Right.
It can be and is done all the time by these big corporations. So, yeah, I think you're trying to be forgiving of something that, you know.
I think that's part of the thing too that makes basically like this element of the movie like completely, or helps sort of contribute to what I think is a complete incoherence, right? Is that return to the status quo, which is inherently a conservative sort of narrative maneuver, right?
Right.
That's the main complaint levied against golden age detective fiction, is that it's inherently conservative and classist because it always restores the status quo.
Right.
So I think that sort of makes it incoherent. And the thing is like, And I tend to agree with Craig here. Is there's a narrative out for that, right? Like you can say like, hey, look, here's the problems, and even if the film chooses not to introduce like broad systemic change because of sort of whatever they've imagined continuity to be in the Snyderverse, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's fine. I can get on board with that, but like that doesn't mean that you don't have. That doesn't mean that you have to avoid any criticism at all.
Right.
Right.
And by the end of the movie, like everything is just sort of back to straight white capitalist, DC, and those are choices that,
and it ends at Christmas, which is about the most capitalistic event in American society.
Yeah, I mean, seriously, I mean, it is a very pro-consumerist ending.
Oh, absolutely.
And I don't think that it's or let me rephrase that. We would be remiss too if we didn't know how white Washington D.C. is in all of these shots.
Mm-hmm.
Right, that's a majority black city, and it's a very particular and peculiar view of that place in that moment.
Yeah,
and I think that I don't think that it's on the filmmakers to resolve all of those problems, but there are different choices that could have been made, that would have either sort of helped at least narrative coherence, or at least, if not narrative coherence, then at least created like a layer of verisimilitude about the place and the moment and the time. If it's really the 80s and that's sort of operating as the backdrop where these things are happening, which is a perfectly legitimate and smart move to make, there are different sort of visual choices that could be made, as far as that stuff goes, that would emphasize the role in all this. Like seeing a punker kid walk around a mall in a Bad Brain shirt is not enough to really sort of reflect like the complexities of that space,
I mean, that's the Hot Topic version of the 80s,
I mean,
right?
they could have done the typical ladies. They could have done the typical ladies thing and just made the black guy the drug dealer, right?
Right. Yeah. Some street tough, right? So,
well, I mean, they gave us breakdancing. What more do you want?
You're right. I've completely forgotten about the breakdancing.
I did too.
The most central component of the entire film.
So
that's letting you know that we're in a real urban environment there, guys.
Right.
So when I watched a movie with my kids, because as we watch all of these movies together, and they know how much my stomach just turns at really saccharine, over the top 80s gestures. Like I just can't watch Stranger Things with them. I can't do this stuff because they probably don't want to watch it with me because I'll be too annoying. So as soon as the breakdancers came on, they both looked at me and they were just waiting to make some sort of jackass comment about something. They're like, "Oh, Dad's gonna hate this."
I'm right there with you when it comes to the 80s nostalgia. I critique it way too much, for one thing. That's not the way it was. But some of my problems with this movie really were more on the character level than the overall plot. I mean, don't get me wrong, the plot's a disaster, and I think we kind of hit the nail on the head with our thoughts on it. DC doesn't really seem to know how to treat its trinity of characters. They've turned Superman into a peeping Tom. They've turned Batman into a killer. And now they've turned Wonder Woman into a rapist. And I mean, maybe inadvertently low-key rape is rape, but it's still there. I don't think they know what to do with these characters or what these characters really represent. And I think that's a big problem with their movie side of it. I do appreciate, like you said, trying to go to the non-violent end of this. But on the other hand, we could have had some very good character development leading into the next movie. If they had done, for instance, Marvel's very good at following some of these storylines from the comic books. If you had let her kill Maxwell Lord and then deal with the consequences of that in the next movie, as they did for a period of time in the comic books. I think that would have been an interesting way to go. Not that that's really a complaint, just a different way to look at it. So,
I mean, I thought that's where they were going with it there for a
yeah.
minute. I thought they were going to give that to us. Don't
get me wrong. I'm kind of glad they didn't. I'm just saying that it could have been a interesting character development for this character.
Yeah.
I tend to agree. I don't think that over the past however many years that they've been putting these films out, like, I just don't think that they understand what to do with them. And it's not as though, it's like I was saying before, I don't think that they have to, I don't want there to be, and I don't think there has to be a one-to-one relationship between the version we get on the screen and the version I grew up reading as a kid. You know, like, that's not fair, and that's not reasonable. But there's something about, like, capturing, like, the essence of these characters and, like, who they are,
right,
that seems really just lost. And it's replaced with, like, this really weird sort of fanboy machismo, you know, weird, like, early days of social media view of the world where, like, no, Batman would kill the Joker and it's dumb that he hasn't. Like, well, that's not stupid, actually. It makes a lot of sense. But, like, I mean, that's like the mentality, though, that follows into that goes into this. Like, I want my characters all dark and gritty. Like, well, no, you don't. Okay. So I mean, I think that you're totally right. Like, they don't understand how to handle these characters. And then when you have one that could have a legitimate sort of violent outburst that makes a lot of sense, you know, you can't really do that anymore, right? Like, if they killed Max Lord in this movie, I think, first of all, like, it would have undone what they're trying to sort of set up with a different sort of imagination of the superhero sort of landscape, which I think is more important. But it would have been, like, the one time in the past, like, 2 or 3 iterations of these characters where, like, oh, okay, there are consequences for this. This makes a lot of sense. Her character is really complicated, and we have to deal with this now. But if they had killed Max Lord in this movie, it would just be another sort of tally mark in the Snyderverse, where a superhero murders somebody because of reasons.
I mean, and that is fair. I mean, that's a fair assessment.
Yeah, I mean, but I agree, though. Like, I'm with you. Like, they don't know how to like operate in this space, like, to allow the characters to be, I don't know, human beings.
I mean, that's absolutely accurate, because the best written Wonder Woman and Superman stories are when you're displaying their humanity, and instead of this super powered person that people can't relate to.
Yeah.
And the whole thing with that is that these are otherworldly figures that have came to Earth, or came to quote unquote man's world, and adopted what should be, you know, the storybook version of humanity, which I say that as a plus, not a negative. They've adopted the best of what we should be, and they exude that way better than the humans who actually should. And I think, yeah, in this latest slate, even somewhat in the Nolan verse, or the Nolan versions of the film of Batman, they lose a lot of that. And look, I mean, I think what largely, I don't want, not laying blame at anybody's feet, but this is the effect of Frank Miller and Alan Moore, right? This is the effect of what they did in comics, in showing us the darker side of, in 1986, of what these things could be. And, you know, when we think about how these movies, the quote unquote Snyderverse especially, is sculpted, even this movie was produced by the Snyders. You know, Zack Snyder made, you know, Watchmen, somehow he made a version of Watchmen that was weirdly darker, possibly more gritty, definitely more edgelord than what Alan Moore made. I mean, it all goes back to that kind of conception that apparently folks, even in the 90s, thought that became the only way to write comics. You know, Brat Pack, you know, which actually came before those books, I think, on the timeline. It really solidified this notion of what people saw these characters at, which is arguably just a hypo male violence fantasy. and even in a show that should be about overt feminism and the power of forgiveness and in truth, that still has come forward in these. So yeah, I don't know, and I don't know how they fix it other than just stop making movies by committee, which I don't know that they can do that.
Well, the way you fix it is you just kind of start writing these characters based upon the characters that they are, and they have been, instead of what you think people want to see. Give us
Right.
what they are.
Yeah.
You know, actually, the way they fix it is they just let Matt Wagner make these movies. Like, just let Matt Wagner do the Trinity that we all need. That's how you fix it.
Just stop listening to fanboys.
Yeah, that get off.
I mean,
yeah,
Oh, please, can we have that in every fandom?
yeah.
Make the movie that it's supposed to be instead of what you think that it should be,
Yeah.
or what is wanted.
I think that's right. I think that's totally right. And I mean, you know, and to say that Frank Miller and Alan Moore sort of beget a lot of this is, you know, that's obviously true. But I think that in a lot of ways, that's also like a really bad reading of those comics.
Oh, 100%. That's the easy reading of them.
Yeah.
But it's also what the most people took away from it, which is unfortunate.
Couldn't agree with you more. And but that's that fanboy
mentality. We're talking about a world that idolized Tyler Durden. So,
yeah.
What do we expect them to take away?
Right. Or sees American Psycho and goes, this makes a lot of sense.
Like, yeah, I should just kill these women instead of
Yeah, just remarkably bad readings of complicated texts.
Yeah, for sure. And it's permeated all levels of fandom in almost every major fandom out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more.
Doctor Who fandom's incredibly toxic right now. We're getting a remake of Justice League because people cried about it enough that they wanted the Snyder cut. So we're getting this because of that. And, to me, it's rewarding bad behavior.
Yeah.
And it took me a long time, but, as a younger man, I used to kind of side eye and scoff at folks like Howard Kruse. No, not Howard Kruse. I hate when I can't remember names. Howard did Blackhawks.
Chaykin.
Yeah, Howard Chaykin. Sorry. Dap's going to kick my ass. I used to kind of scoff in my early 20s at things when Chaykin would say some of these same things, and it took me forever to realize how just right he was. And that may be either me becoming a curmudgeonly old man or wiser. I haven't decided yet.
In fairness, it's because Chaykin says the right thing in a very curmudgeonly old man way, and always has.
Yeah. Also true.
So I'll be quick about this because I want to get to talking about the fun stuff with Zach. But one of my major issues with this was actually in the opening scene, and it's something that if you're thinking about these as this movie is trying to say something broader, it is when Diana quote unquote cheated, and they brought in this big moralistic lesson about how she took the shorter path. I didn't like that's where they actually went with that. I mean, yes, it was her fault for looking back behind her that she got knocked off the tree. But what I took away from that, what I saw is a young woman improvising and adapting to her surroundings to achieve. I mean, yeah, she took an easier path, but what's the opposite of that? Like what happens if she doesn't do that? She just quits. She just stands on the road watching her horse run away. I think that's the wrong message. Like I was trying to think, okay, what else should she have done? I mean, obviously
she didn't get in trouble for that. She just didn't win. It's not like she was scolded for it or said, that's wrong. It's just that you can't win by taking the shortcut.
No, I mean, that's true. And
which isn't always necessarily true in life, by the way. You can win by taking shortcuts, but it's a life lesson for a kid is what it was intended for.
And I get that. And again, I agree with the inevitable lesson is that when you purposefully cheat, when you purposefully look for ways to do shortcuts and stuff, that's wrong. And you shouldn't be allowed to win. when taken as it was given, I didn't see somebody who purposefully cheated. I saw somebody who got knocked down, for maybe not for doing the wrong things, but then found a way to get to the end goal, which I don't necessarily think of that as cheating, especially not when it was not done with any animus, or it wasn't done to slight anybody else. I mean, yeah, of course it was a race and somebody had to win and she wanted to win, but like I said, what's the opposite of that? You're like kids. If kids get knocked down, or if people get knocked down and they can't grind their way, um, they if they can't, if things aren't hard, if they can't find the path of least resistance, then they don't deserve any kind of, like, they don't deserve what they get at the end. And again, I'm not saying that was what was said, but just in the way that they presented that. Again, I think they had a really good motive behind that. I think there was a really good end game to the lesson, but what I inevitably saw was a failure to send off that message. And so it just, from the very beginning, I kind of just had to bite my tongue a little bit at what, and again, I think that should have been a precursor for kind of what, Zack talked about, which is they're not going to get to the place that you want to get them with this, but just hang on and find what you can, latch on to what you can to get as much as you can out of this. Which is where I came from with it. Again, the worst parts of the film, just from a viewer standpoint, the CGI is not great. And part of me wants to forgive the CGI in this, because maybe they were trying to send it back to elements of those very 80s things. They're trying to, like the flight scenes, it looked like a little bit like early Superman, and maybe that's what they were trying to do. But again, I don't think it's necessary. And just as a whole, the CGI was bad. The Hubs and I spent yesterday playing board games and watching, and I don't think it's fair to compare the two, but watching Marvel movies, and Marvel movies that they made 8 years ago had much better CGI in places that they weren't trying to prove a point. They weren't trying to make a point. And even in this film, in places that I don't think that they were trying to remind you of something, CGI was just bad. Like who, like, I don't know who's in charge of these things.
I think it's fair to compare them because they're made in the same environments. I mean, it's not like Marvel has different access to different technology. The technology's out there for everybody. And I would be more of it if this wasn't a trend in every DC movie.
Yeah, because it is in every single DC movie. And we were talking about things that were just unnecessary in this film. I know, Craig, you mentioned this, that you felt like certain scenes, certain aspects were unnecessary. I think Steve Trevor as a whole was unnecessary in this movie. And that's like, I love the relationship there. Like I said, this, I'm looking at a giant omnibus. I've got a whole section on my bookshelf that is nothing but Wonder Woman stuff. And I love that relationship, but you could have done callbacks to it and not had it. You didn't need the most egregious things in this film tie into moments where Steve Trevor's there. Like Craig mentioned, the consent issues with the fact that he took over somebody's body, and they didn't acknowledge it, and they banged it out 1 or 2 times, and then she sees him again at the end of the show. I mean, and arguably that whole thing was just so they could do a fashion montage, just like they did in the first film with her, but from a male perspective. It wasn't necessary. The jumping in the jet for the invisible plane, totally unnecessary. You could have given us an invisible plane without Steve Trevor majestically and magically knowing how to operate technology that didn't exist when he died. So just, he didn't play an important role to the plot other than just being the buddy cop, which I just, again, I don't think was necessary. So for me, taking him out makes this a slightly more cohesive film. Not cohesive in its entirety. I don't think you can call it cohesive, but it would help. It would go a long way in aiding with that. And at the end of the day, I think that's Warner Brothers, AT&T, and DC's biggest problem, is they don't know how to make a cohesive movie. And part of that is because they're doing filmmaking by committee.
Well, real quick, one more thing to add to all of this is, this whole thing is kind of, and as Zack said, instead of being anti-grifter, anti-wish,
Right.
And the funny thing is whenever Wonder Woman needs a new power, all she has to do is want it enough and she gets it.
Well, I mean, yeah, perks of being a kid.
She's able to turn the jet invisible just because she wants it enough. She's able to fly just because she wants it enough, with pretty much an explanation that's similar to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the art of flying is just falling without hitting the ground. That's pretty much the explanation she gets for how to fly.
Yeah.
Well, now I will say in that, and this is just me kind of being a fanboy and nerd boy, I don't think she's actually flying. I think she is riding on the air currents, which there's comic book
that is literally what flying is.
Well, true, but I'm talking about she's not flying in the way that Superman flies. Like she can't just and the whole scenes where she was lassoing lightning, like unnecessary and unneeded and problematic or whatever is that word. They were trying to again show you that she is not propelling herself. There's a reason why she turns her lasso into a propeller. She's gliding on air pockets. This is that version, old school version of Wonder Woman who couldn't fly by herself. She has to have some force motivating her. And so I gave that a pass. Again, that's just me giving it a pass. Nobody else has to. I think that there was some of that there at the end of the movie. I still don't think she can actually, fly in the way that Superman flies. She has
it still doesn't change essentially what I said.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. I just had to. The nerd in me had to throw that in there.
Yeah, no problem. As she needs something, all she has to do is want it enough, and she has it. True. Which is anti-thematic to the rest of the movie.
Yeah, see, that's part of what I'm saying too. Is like it's the Wisher,
right?
Right.
And
her dad's Zeus,
which is fair enough, I guess.
Right.
Not everyone's dad gets to have Zeus be their dad.
Yeah. Right.
But it's still about sort of that wish power and like having the right wish, and that are you good enough for this wish right now? And that allows you to get the things that you want.
Are you going to use this wish for good or evil? Because that's what determines whether it's good or not.
Yeah.
Which actually opens us up for a good way to segue into something else, which I'm very excited to segue to, because not only is Zack a person who delivers incredibly smart commentary on tentpole cheesecake movies with us, and we're glad he does so. Zack is also a educator. He is he's a doctor. Literally, he's a doctor. Got it right by his name. He is a person who teaches comics, and this is one of the reasons I fanboy over him. But he teaches comics at the collegiate level, and he writes some very intelligent things about them. And he has an upcoming book that is soon to be available to you, me, and everybody else to don our bookshelves with. And part of what makes Zack so cool is that he is, and I don't know that he would use this language, and he can correct me if it's wrong, he's one of the foremost kind of scholars on Steve Ditko. And his upcoming book, and I'll just let him pitch on it, but it really takes a look at the ideology of Steve Ditko and how that's a little bit misinterpreted. And it ties into some of the very things that I think Wonder Woman attempted to tie in with, like we're talking about this neoliberal grift, the prosperity doctrine, the just all of it. So I'm going to turn things over to Zack. And he hates doing this, but I'm going to make him anyway, to just pitch himself a little bit and tell folks about what the book entails.
Yeah, I do hate the self-promotion. Just mostly because I'm not real good at it. I'm real good about talking about other people's stuff. I can tell you how great everyone else is, but when it comes to my own shit, I'm like, I can just kind of do a little bit of this, a little bit of that. But anyway, no, I am. But what Caleb said is accurate. So I'm Dr. Zack Kruse, and I have a PhD in American Studies, literary studies. I do a lot of work in critical race theory and critiques of whiteness and neoliberalism, and I'm also really interested in sort of how grift happens. Right? Like I'm really fascinated by grift, which is conveniently for me as a scholar and for my career has really sort of been a buzzword of late, I guess. So I spend a lot of time sort of thinking through these problems and where these problems come from and how they perpetuate themselves and, and on and on and on. So For my first book-length project, though, I put together this comprehensive study on the work of Steve Ditko, and it is a critical re-examination of his philosophy. It's not a biography by any stretch of the imagination. I didn't want to do a biography. It's just taking Ditko's words and ideas as he put them down in comics form and in essay form and in letters, and thinking through what they mean in their moment and what their sort of broader implications are. Like, what do we do with this information? And the big reason that I wanted to make sure that a project like this exists is because, number one, I'm not saying anything that anyone that listens to the show probably doesn't already think or know, but comics are important. Comics are really important as vehicles for helping shape the way we think and respond and react and sort of comment on the world around us. They do this all the time. They've done this from the very beginning. Comics have never not done this. And the fact that they, at one time, were one of the most widely read mediums in the country is important. It's really important that we take a moment to think through these ideas. And it's even more important now that some of these ideas that were so popular and meant so much to us as kids are now multi-billion-dollar global franchises that are sort of reinscribing their ideals and their philosophies and all around the world, and shaping the way that we talk to one another and think. So we have to sort of take a moment to sort of step back and sort of zoom out to sort of figure out the scope of all this. And then once we've zoomed out to figure out what's going on here, be able to zoom in on particular moments and contributors to the medium, right? So one of those really important people, as we all know, is Steve Ditko. So when Ditko, yeah, you know him. We all know Steve Areno, right? And so when I came up to Michigan State and I was working on this project, I mean, that's how I pitched it, right? And it went over pretty well because Michigan State has a long history of popular culture studies and American studies. It was, one of the leading American studies programs in the country for a very long time until that program was collapsed. And so I had some opportunities to do some good work here. And we also have the largest public collection of comic books in the world. We have the largest library archive of them. So again, more reason for me to be here to do this work. And as I've been a Ditko reader more or less my entire life, since about 4th, 5th grade. And there's just so much going on with his work. And he's someone who is so widely misunderstood and misrepresented and misinterpreted that it became important to me to sort of start thinking through what some of those misconceptions were, and even sort of highlighting my own problems, my own misreadings of him, and sort of reassessing all of this. So one of the things the book does right away is it dismisses two or three major notions that sort of plague Ditko. And that's probably not fair to say that they plague him, but that are, let's say, persistent in sort of fan responses to Ditko. The first is that he's a recluse. No, he wasn't. He was never a recluse. Just because someone doesn't want to talk to you doesn't make them a recluse. So, I don't spend a lot of time on that because the book is not a biography, but I think that that's an important thing to just get out of the way with him. He's a human being who had relationships and family ties and all of those things, and was, available to the public, much more so than many other people were. So there is that part of it. But another thing that sort of gets misconstrued with him a lot is his how do I want to say this? His relationship with objectivism, the Ayn Rand's sort of pseudo philosophy, or philosophy, depending on your perspective. I think that I've made my perspective pretty clear here. So, and Ditko likes Rand, and he was certainly motivated by many of her works, and a lot of his characters sort of reflect that. Elements of that ideology, but to say that he is an objectivist, to say that he is some sort of disciple of Randianism, or that it is this sort of defining feature of his work, is just not accurate. It's not true. Again, that's not saying that he didn't like it. He did, very much so. And he thought that many of Rand's ideas were foundational to sort of his worldview, but that's not the same thing as being sort of, like I said, a disciple, an adherent, an unquestioning adherent to these ideas. He seemed to question them a lot. And as I read Ditko's career throughout this book, beginning in 1953, and then I stop more or less around 86 with the major readings, but I do some later. I do some analysis of some later works as well. But one of the things that we find with him is that his ideas really fit within this much more complicated sort of network of ideas that are related to sort of changes in the way that liberalism operates in the U.S. And when we talk about liberalism, we don't really mean the American left, and that we identify liberalism with the American left is perhaps arguably telling about how far to the right we really are as a country. But when we think of Ditko, I mean, it's fair to think of liberalism because he is invested in sort of the ideals of Enlightenment, liberal thought and philosophy and individualism and all of those things. He seems to like those quite a bit. He seems to have a fair understanding of what he thinks capitalism is and should be and how it could and should operate. But he's also operating in this moment where liberalism, like I said, is really starting to change in really significant ways. And one of those areas where it's changing is post-World War II with the injection of what we might call the New Thought movement or the mind power movement or the power, or what Dale Carnegie would call the power of positive thinking, or not Dale Carnegie. Dale Carnegie would call the, how to win friends and influence people, or how Norman Vincent Peale, what Norman Vincent Peale would call the power of positive thinking. So he's operating within that landscape. And without coincidence, Ayn Rand and her one-time lover and sort of co-founder of objectivism, Nathaniel Branden, were really sort of invested in those ideas too. Whether they would admit that or not is a separate conversation, but the ways in which they talk about these things overlap in really remarkable and significant ways. Nathaniel Branden, even after being excommunicated from objectivism by Ayn Rand, went on to write more than a dozen books on more than a dozen self-help books about sort of self-esteem, right? So where Norman Vincent Peale might talk about the power of positive thinking, Branden would just reframe that and call it self-esteem. They're more or less talking about the same thing, and even relying on some of the same sort of historical language to sort of get these ideas across. So Ditko's work sort of operates in that landscape, which again is not to say that he's a singular adherent to any one set of philosophic ideals or political ideals. He is very much his own mind, his own thinker, and his own sort of brand, right? I mean, he believes that, or believed that, I guess might be the correct conjugation of the verb there, but he believed that each individual should have their own philosophy, and that you must have your own philosophy in order to sort of navigate the world in a meaningful way. And he certainly did that, but where his philosophy fits in is within this sort of, web of ideas. But where those ideas come from and what they do and what their effects are really rooted in sort of this the mind power movement, which is not, exclusively married to New Thought or to Christian Science, but, it has a much longer history that, at least goes back to Emanuel Swedenborg, but perhaps, reasonably longer. Anybody who says that someone is the first to do something is probably wrong. There's usually someone before that.
Right.
So Ditko's wrapped up in all this because these ideas, they really start to take hold and like change the way that we as a country sort of operate, like how our political capital moves, because we've become so obsessed with this notion of, keeping up with the Joneses, and that you can keep up with the Joneses if you just think hard enough. You can survive and navigate corporate culture, the white collar world, if you just make the right friends and you learn how to manipulate people and talk to them in the right way. Well, where do all these ideas come from? They come from you, the person. You have to think and you have to sort of meditate on these things. And by meditating, by thinking, by sort of ruminating and sort of excavating your own sort of interior space, you can find out who you are in a moment, and who you are in a moment will then be reflected in the outside world. And that will
attract you to good things. But if who you are in a moment is negative or vile, there's some sort of, badness about you, to not use a $64 word. If there's some sort of badness about you, you're going to attract bad things, right? So for instance, to bring it back to, say, Nathaniel Branden, Branden believed that people who lack self-esteem, or the lack of self-esteem, was the root cause of drug addiction, murder, crime, rape, divorce, any bad thing you can think of that's related to a lack of self-esteem. That's because you feel bad about yourself and that you need to sort of fix your brain, right? There are no sort of external pressures that sort of lead to these problems. It's only you that creates them. That's almost the exact same thing as what we would see later with someone like Rhonda Byrne in a book like The Secret, right? Where like attracts like, where good attracts good, where bad attracts bad. If you want good things to happen to you, you have to think positive thoughts. Well, that's Norman Vincent Peale too. So these ideas, they get all tangled up, right? And they're not necessarily coherent, but they do have a through line that sort of keeps them all sort of on the same sort of string here. They're all part of the same web. And in people that were motivated by this, were varied, and they were very popular. And there's a lot of good books about sort of the rise of the Christian right and how someone like Peale gets involved in all of those things. But one of the most important figures that was really motivated by all of this stuff was Ronald Reagan. Reagan, as it is well documented, well known, had an interest in the occult, had an interest in the New Thought movement. He was certainly aware of a book called The Secret Doctrine of America by Manly P. Hall, which claims all sorts of interesting things about sort of the history of the country. And Reagan would quote from it frequently. And so Reagan was really sort of invested in this sort of ideology, and is sort of the masthead for this sort of mystic liberal thinking, right? We might call it neoliberalism, but because there's this sort of mystical mind power element to it, I call it mystic liberalism. And that has real serious consequences, and that we're still dealing with, as we discussed with this movie. So Ditko's ideas sort of fit within that trajectory and help us understand sort of these complexities, and reveal sort of certain secrets about them to us, and how one might be able to come to these ideas and make some sort of use of them. So that's sort of a long-winded way to sort of get around what's happening in the book, sort of a broad sort of overview of all of this. And I think some of the most interesting things about, what I was able to sort of tease out with all of this is that, first of all, it really opens up Doctor Strange to a lot of different readings, much more interesting readings. Same thing with Spider-Man, but even with characters like Mr. A and The Question, who are probably some of Ditko's most criticized characters, there's something really different happening there than a superficial reading would give them. Ditko writes about the right to kill for superheroes. And a superficial reading of that would imply or would suggest that Ditko thinks that masked vigilantes should be killing muggers because that's just what they should do. If a mugger commits a crime, then they've forfeited their right to life and they should be murdered in the street or tossed off a building or whatever. And that's their comeuppance. It's really not clear that Ditko thinks that at all. He's using these ideas. I mean, Mr. A and The Question, these are philosophical constructs that allow us to sort of navigate sort of the inner complexities of the mind and think through good and bad choices and what those say about us and how we respond to them, or how they help us respond to a moment. So there's a lot happening in there where I'm really working hard to sort of unsettle some of these very sort of superficial assumptions about him, not to write an apologetic, but because, like I said at the outset, these are complicated stories that are worth thinking about, that say something about a moment. And if they don't, even if we want to say they don't say something about a moment, they say something about a particular thinker, a particular sort of philosopher, someone who is working hard to put his ideas out in the world so that they can be responded to and adapted or modified in unique ways. I think that that's really important. And Ditko is one of those voices that gives us an opportunity to do that. So I'll leave it there. and anything else you want to talk about is fine. But that's really what's at the core of this. Is this is a unique thinker. What do we do with this information? Why does it matter?
Well, you can't look at somebody whose work is as complex as Ditko's was and not assume that their kind of philosophies and the way they think about the world is not complex. And I think you're right. I mean, other than Spider-Man, I think a lot of people like to look at The Question or Mr. A, especially in his later work, in the stuff that he did away from the quote unquote, away from the big two, or away from Marvel Comics specifically. And they like to talk about those characters as it's an identifier of his only way of thinking. But I mean, you can't look at the work that he did on Spider-Man or he did with the Blue Beetle, and not understand that there is he's kind of casting a net as far as trying to discuss and to uncover, and in a way it's his way of processing it himself, these larger questions, right? I mean, or am I kind of missing the mark there?
No, I think that's a lot of what's happening, right? I mean, each of those stories that you've identified, they are explorations of interiority.
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean to be this particular person? Doctor Strange and Spider-Man and Blue Beetle all give us opportunities to understand that. And to think through like sort of the growing pains and the changes that people deal with as they go on their own individual sort of journeys towards enlightenment, whatever that might mean. It's exactly what happens with all of those characters. Doctor Strange very specifically goes into interior spaces and is in sort of inside his own mind in all of those places. He's always going inside to pocket dimensions, right? I don't think that Dormammu, I mean, I'm sure you've heard me say this other places, but when he goes into the dark dimension to deal with Dormammu, he's gone inside of his own mind. And symbolically, he's fighting against sort of the darker, more fascistic impulses that perhaps haunt all of us,
mm-hmm.
and might not be able to be defeated, but can at least be put at bay, right? That can be held off, that can be staved off and sort of kept in check, right? Because in sort of complicated ways, that impulse is also holding back something even potentially worse, which is the mindless ones, like no mind at all, right? Just to be this sort of animalistic type thing that has no human emotion, no intellect, no capacity for humanity, right? I mean, Dormammu is the barrier between those things, right? Even though Dormammu is absolutely evil and disgusting and must be kept in check and must be stopped, there is something potentially worse on the other side of him. And Doctor Strange wants us to sort of the comic Doctor Strange wants us to be able to sort of think through those complexities and realize, like, man, every day is a struggle. Mm-hmm. and is a struggle against baser impulses, is a struggle against ourselves, is a struggle against external forces, any number of things, right, that must be sort of handled, right? Like, how do we navigate the world, right? Doctor Strange wants us to be able to think about that in internal terms. Peter Parker deals with the same thing, right? If you think about those really sort of like the most idealized moment in Peter Parker's life, or Ditko's run on Spider-Man, for most people, I think, is at the end of is in page 4 or 5 of Amazing Spider-Man 33, where Peter Parker is the lifting sequence where he finally lifts all that weight off of himself. Well, he's unburdening himself, right, from a lot. I mean, he's physically unburdening himself from the rubble, which he's trapped inside of and underneath, which is not insignificant.
And in that case, he's like guilt and grief, I think, are some of the obvious things.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, when he is dealing with Aunt May and Uncle Ben, right? Mm-hmm. Like they're ghosts, like the sort of ethereal forms of Aunt May and Uncle Ben. I mean, he is dealing with the weight of guilt and the weight of grief and how to move on and move past that and to be his own person, right? I mean, that's a really deep, emotional, personal, internal struggle that comic, that story is grappling with, that Ditko is grappling with as the writer of that story. So, and we see that throughout, and even in Blue Beetle, there's Blue Beetle stories. There's an unpublished Blue Beetle story. Well, it was originally unpublished, but it's been reprinted now, where Blue Beetle deals with murder, right? He feels that he might be responsible for the death of
of an enemy, and he has to grapple with the complex feelings that come along with that. And how does he approach that in a way that's very different from how I think a lot of people would give Ditko credit for. It's much more complicated. Stories like Hawk and Dove are almost entirely about balance and forgiveness and grace. And on down the line, Shade the Changing Man is another great example of this. So he's really like always thinking through these problems in ways that are really nuanced and really hard. And I don't always like the answers that he comes up with, but he is coming up with unique answers that respond to a moment. There's a lot to be said for that.
Well, I think that kind of ties into some of what we were talking about. Even with things like the Wonder Woman film, you might not like the outcomes or where they get to, but it's making you think about these broader concepts. And I love it specifically because it is comics, right? Like these broader conceptualizations of art and interpretation. And in my personal opinion, I think comics specifically, at least for America, the United States, that it's a blueprint of our culture. And then sometimes, yes, it's written for a younger audience. It doesn't have to be. I think, in the last 40 years, it's become an adult medium, quote unquote, although it was always an adult medium as we're kind of talking about these themes with Ditko, but it's a blueprint walking you through the exploration of our own identity, of our Western identity, of the concepts of our governance, of the Republic. And I love that these things are there. And for Ditko, especially, like you said, it's the interiority. And when you juxtapose that with a creator, like Jack Kirby, who is always more expansive, like he was always looking out. He was always more trying to conceptualize what else might be out in the universe, or what might be behind the veil and the beyond. And I'm not saying that wasn't its own metaphor for the world that we live in, but it's just it's inherently different in its makeup and in the way that you conceptualize it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, Kirby his work always strikes me as much more operatic, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's very about the outside world, where Ditko's is almost exclusively about the inside world. Certainly in the stories that he wrote, anyway. I think that's a really smart comparison. Or sort of contrast between the two.
But before we kind of wrap this up, because I know we all got to go eat lunch because we're hungry. But I wanted to ask you. So one thing we have talked about this in terms of Ditko is we've looked at like the Norman Vincent Peale and his power of positive thinking, and kind of how that led to the Ayn Randianism and the objectivism that Ditko. I mean this literally, bought into. He gave them a lot of money over time. But I think that might have been, and I think you hit on this in the book, that it was because it was the closest thing that he found to help him explore these things. But what do you think his opinion was, or what do you know his opinion was, if you know it, of the other side of that coin, which is the prosperity gospel? It's the, Billings and Jerry Falwell, who literally Reagan invited into the White House. Like they helped him craft trickle down economics, so to speak. I think, I'm not a fan of Reagan at all, and I think folks who know me know that. But he took this, what we're talking about, this pyramid scheme, this grift up mentality, and he applied it to American governance. What was Ditko's opinion on that side of the coin, as far as the prosperity doctrine, or do you know if he ever even spoke about that?
Well, he didn't speak about it, at least not that I'm aware of, not in any essays or anything like that. And one thing before I get to that, though, is it's not that Peale leads to Rand or Rand leads to Peale. It's that these are ideas that are all sort of happening at the same moment.
Right.
So it's in the Zeitgeist, as it were, because so much of this is coming out of, as I said, New Thought, which is responding to the horrors of like sort of the resurgence of the New Thought movement in the 20th century, is responding to the horrors of the First World War,
mm-hmm.
And trying to sort of recapture individualism in a moment where people are really frightened and scared and unsure. And something similar is happening after the Second World War too, where capitalism has totally failed as a result of the global depression. So now neoliberalism is trying to sort of reconceptualize how capitalism is going to work. And the way that they do that is to bring in New Thought, which in its earlier sort of iterations was invested in individualism, but was really more interested in sort of like a democratic socialist imagination of that. And people like Wallace Wattles are really sort of key to understanding that. And a lot of sort of contemporary New Thought people and New Thought historians are, emphasize that point, like Mitch Horowitz, who I rely on a lot for the book because I think he's sharp about the history here, makes a special point of that. So there's something that's just in the air where all of these ideas are sort of stewing around. But for Ditko's part, I mean, he was an atheist. He was an avowed atheist. He did produce some sort of political cartoon type comics where he deals with mysticism and religion and all of those things. And he's categorically opposed to that kind of thinking. He is opposed to what he understands as that very particular kind of magical thinking. And doesn't think that it's a viable philosophy, doesn't think that it's a viable sort of path forward. And is trying to choose something different, is trying to sort of construct something different for himself. Where that gets complicated is that not that he's being hypocritical, but that he's not sort of really dealing with the realities of the situation, which include that that sort of mystic angle that is a part of Randianism. And Ayn Rand and Nathaniel Branden, they would deny being mystics up and down, but their work says something different. Their ideas say something really different. Even someone like Norman Vincent Peale might deny that a strict association with sort of the occult, because that's what New Thought is. It is occultic thinking. He might deny the occult in that way, but that doesn't mean that he's not implicated in that sort of network of ideas. Same thing with Dale Carnegie. Is he writing an explicitly religious or occult text? No, but he is dealing with the exact same sort of principles, and on down the line. So that's sort of what I mean when I say that these things they're complicated, right? Like there's not a singular way of imagining this. That's a very sort of religious, dogmatic view of it that's not sensible. They are sort of, as I keep saying, there's a network, there's a web of ideas here that are rooted in this very particular view of the world. And I think really what's at the core of this, though, what brings all of these things together is neoliberalism, is capitalism, because that's what capitalism tries to do. It tries to perpetuate itself. How can it perpetuate itself this time? Well, it's going to co-opt this earlier movement because it works, because it's compelling, because it helps it survive in some way. And it doesn't have to be genuine. It doesn't have to be sincere. It just has to sort of make money. Intentionally or not, Ditko gets sort of swept up in that moment, while trying to sort of create a philosophy that is uniquely and distinctly his own. So like I use the term in the book, mystic liberalism. He would never, ever in a million years identify himself as that. And at no point would I argue, or do I argue in the book, that he would self-identify as that. He would never do that. His philosophy is the Ditko philosophy. It is his perspective. It is his outlook. It has nothing to do with anything else other than how he interprets these texts and sees the world in those ways. So I don't know if that quite answers your question, but as it relates to like explicit magic, explicit wish thinking, he would say no. But as it relates to the broader sort of mystical concept that your thoughts are generative of your reality, I think that he is on the hook for a lot of that, is implicated in those conversations in a really sort of meaningful way.
Came as close to answering my question as I think anybody possibly could.
Yeah. I mean, he didn't say explicitly, right? And he couldn't have, because he's not talking about those things. He doesn't see it quite that way. He sees it more as an individual journey. It's just a matter of making clear that individual journey, as he conceptualizes it,
is, has to do with some other really difficult stuff.
And I would love to thank you for coming on our show this week. I know I've been quiet while you were talking, but I could sit here and listen to you speak for hours, I feel like. No, I mean, seriously, I'm looking forward to getting your book, and I will be getting it and reading it. So
good.
Thanks for coming on and sharing all of that with us.
No, I'm glad.
And bringing up the general intelligence of this podcast by probably 40-fold.
Oh, I don't know about that. I can't. See, this is. See, you're getting me all wrapped up in the shit that Caleb was just saying that I don't like to do. I'm like, see, I can't. I don't know. But
well, it's nonetheless true, and I'm just going to echo Craig because he said it best, as normally he does. More times than often, I should just need to shut up and let Craig talk, and we would be better.
It'd be an awfully quiet podcast if we did that.
Well, the book, we should say, and I don't know if I said this at first, and if so, forgive me. We're only 158 episodes in. I'm still new at this. The book is Mysterious Travelers, Steve Ditko and the Search for a New Liberal Identity. Of course, as you just heard, it is written by Dr. Zack Kruse, published by the University of Mississippi Press, who I'm a big fan of. They have, if you're wanting to, if you've enjoyed this conversation and you want to look at comics in a more academic sense and kind of look at comics in the sense of something that can be studied like literature as it should be, who can be explored in these very smart ways that say something broader about culture and where we're at. University of Mississippi Press has an amazing catalog. I've given them quite a bit of money in the past about 2 weeks just because I keep looking at their books and I'm like, oh, well, that's awesome. And I need more of it. And like I said, they're publishing Zach's book, and it's really great. It's a great way to think about comics. And I think when you read stuff like what Zach has written, or like we've spoken about, or some of these other books that are put out by University of Mississippi Press, that's not just going to influence the way you read those books. Those ideas are going to plant seeds, and they are going to allow you to look at the comics that are being produced today, right now, in a way that is more than just at face value. These are more than just myths. Like, I mean, they are myths, but they are more than just people punching people, fighting these creative works. They deserve to be studied. They deserve to be discussed, critiqued, extrapolated upon, and hopefully we bring a little bit of that to the show. And man, this was fun. So I can't wait to do this again. Once I've read the book, hopefully we can get Zach to come back on the show. Would love nothing more.
That would be great. When is this book going to be readily available for the public?
It releases February 15th.
Oh, okay.
Nice.
And be able to get it on Amazon or from, I thought I heard you talk about Diamond earlier.
Yes. Yeah, it's available through Amazon now. You can pre-order it there. You can pre-order it through the Mississippi website. Sometimes they have some really terrific sales. So if you keep an eye out for those sales, then it's worth your time. And then it was also available in the Diamond Previews catalog for November.
Okay.
So there you can always, your retailer can always place a late order for that. And then if folks out there listening, if they pick up a copy of the book from Challengers Comics in Chicago, or if they pre-ordered it through Discount Comic Book Service, then I'm going to be including a little sort of book plate with each of those orders. So yeah, it's available everywhere. It'll be in regular bookshops as well. And
okay.
Yeah, it's around.
That's amazing. Congrats on that, sir.
I'm just saying, if our little network of nerds could make this a New York Times bestseller, I'd be happy. I'd be happy for Zach. We need to make that happen. This is going to be a must read. I've already, like I said, being in the podcast game and considered like low key journalist, we might have gotten a little insight, a little early read of the book. And from what I've read of it, it literally is a must read for anybody. If you love comics, you like Ditko, you got to read it. It's the good.
for whatever it's worth, I shared in advance a really sloppy, like not at all edited copy of this with the family and with Ditko's family, and the response from them was really overwhelmingly positive too. So that's been a real sort of joy and reward in this.
That's fantastic.
So if there's questions about, you know, how I approach some of these things, you know, I didn't just go off half cocked with that stuff. I mean, I checked in and everyone seems to be on board.
That's fantastic. Like I can imagine that's a huge feeling. I don't even know what that feeling would feel like, but it's got to be a little bit of a sigh of relief, a bit of pride, a lot. So,
well, you know, as an English major, you know that you're not always concerned with what the author thinks about your interpretation of a text.
Right.
But when you're dealing with really big claims in, you know, a real sort of thorough reread or recontextualization of stuff, like you don't want to go off, you know, too half cocked with all these things, like I said. So that was very rewarding and you know, reassuring.
You got to cite your evidence. You got to have evidence to back it up. Cite your sources, and you do. You do above and beyond. So again, man, thanks for coming on the show. We are going to end in the way that we always do. Unlike Ditko, we are going to look outwards. We are going to look into the future a little bit to next week by telling you a comic that we think that it would be worth your time to pick up for one reason or another. We think you'll enjoy it because we think we'll enjoy it. Now I offered this to Zach, and I don't know if he picked a book. Zach, did you have a book coming out next week that you wanted to pitch or in the near future?
Not one coming out next week, but one that's out now that I'd like to pitch.
Oh, for sure. Go for it, bro.
Okay. You want me to go first?
Yeah, you're the guest. We're going to be nice.
Oh, you're so sweet. You're so kind to me. So the book that I want to make sure that people are reading is called Come Home Indio by Jim Terry, who I got to know fairly well over the past few years. It is Jim's first memoir comic, autobio comic about his life as a Ho-Chunk Indian, and sort of splitting his life between first Southern California and then the Ho-Chunk Reservation in Wisconsin, and his life in Chicago, and sort of the complexities of growing up in that space and being a native person trying to sort of navigate that space. And it feels very no holds barred on it, and it's an incredibly moving and wonderful story. And I've seen Jim, you know, work on a lot of different projects over the past, I don't know, I guess 8-9 years that I've known him. But this is easily the best thing I think he's ever done. And he wears his Eisner influences on his sleeve throughout all of this. And it's just a really wonderful read. So I hope other folks pick it up too, because it should be like on every like best of list.
Nice.
All right.
There you go.
I'll go next. So this is probably going to come as a huge surprise to all of our listeners. There's a new book by Marvel coming out called Star Wars: The High Republic. And this is going to be in an era of Star Wars where we haven't had any stories told before, about 200 years before the Skywalker saga, in what is the golden age of the Jedi. So looking forward to this new era that they're going to be telling stories in for a minute.
See, I knew I should have went first just so I could have stole that from you and get some sense of vengeance for Matt. Or at least make him feel like everything was normal again. When I saw this, I was like, oh yeah, Craig is giddy over this.
Oh yeah.
Because, you know, you like Star Wars, okay?
Yeah, it's all right.
Well, there is a book coming out, and it's not a number one. It is actually a number 2. But I enjoyed the first issue so much, I want folks to go pick up the second, and if they can, get their hands on the first. And that book comes out from a little company that I don't read a lot of, and I mean that non-sarcastically. I really don't, but it's Antarctic Press. And the book is called Cat Shit 1, and this is actually the second volume. It is a reprinting of a manga written by Motofumi Kobayashi. Like I said, it comes out from Anarch Press. This is essentially an anthropomorphic story that takes place in Vietnam. And the book is kind of split up. So the first part is this story of cats and bunnies and rats and all of these different animals who are, they're people, and they are in the middle of the Vietnam War. They're the members of the Special Forces unit Cat Shit 1, and they're just trying to make it through. It is a really, really, really well written war story, which I'm not a big fan of war, but I do tend to like war stories, especially when they're smartly written and they have some nuance, and you throw nuance into a talking rabbit and you've got me hooked. The back half of the book is even cooler because it's the same artist, the same storyteller, but he's not writing an anthropomorphic story. He takes a look at specific units of special forces, of military units, and kind of explains to the reader what they were and puts them in the middle of a story. It's a one and done thing. The first issue, it was a SAS unit from Australia that he kind of looked at. The art is gorgeous. It's historical fiction, and it's just I can't preach about it enough because again, it's just the best of what it is. It's a great version of it, and it was originally printed in manga. So as I'm trying to expand my own reading habits and stuff, I gotta send a shout out to this. So go check those out. And while you're checking those out, get those lists ready because, like our good friend Zach here said, there are books that were put out this year that need to be on your top 10 list. And now I got to go find this book to make sure it deserves a place to find that out. We don't have a date yet, but either next week or week after next, we are going to do our kind of best of show where we talk about our top 10 favorite books from the year. Just give it a little rundown for what our opinions are worth, which, they're, like I said, sometimes I should just shut up and let Craig talk, and that'll be worth more. But we hope you have enjoyed our little show here. We've certainly enjoyed our time getting together and chatting. Much love to Dr. Kruse over here for his intelligence and just great insights to everything. Can't wait to get you back on. And if we've got nothing further, Craig, did I miss anything?
Nope, I think you nailed it all.
All right. Well, Zach, we at the end of every show, we like to give people a directive. And I don't know if you've heard this bit before, but I like to say something like, go forth and love comics. And then Craig says something like, woo. And that's how we wrap it.
That came from our old co-host, Jerry. He started doing that at the end of every show. And when he left, we just had to keep it going. So
you got to keep it alive. The Jerry Woo, as we like to say.